Hey there, this is Kamal, and in this video we're going to learn about JavaScript. So let's get this started. Alright, so first things first, why do you think we need to learn about JavaScript? So previously we've seen how we can create websites using HTML and CSS. But the main problem with that is that both HTML and CSS are not programming languages, wherein HTML is a markup language and CSS is a styling language. So we don't have any way for us to actually include any kind of logic. So if you want to include any kind of programming logic, in that case you have to use something else. And that is where JavaScript comes into picture. So we generally use JavaScript to add in more functionality for the website. This generally includes like animations, stopwatches or anything like that which requires a programming logic. Then that, means that we are going to use JavaScript. So in this video, we'll see how we can actually connect JavaScript to the website and also see some of the basic programming things that we need to learn inside of JavaScript. Okay, so let's see how we can do that. Alright, so I've opened a blank project inside my VS Code, and in that I only have one file called as index.html, and inside that I have the basic boilerplate template. Now let's see how we can actually include JavaScript into this. So there are actually two ways in which we can actually include JavaScript inside our web page. The first way is by using the tag called as script. So we have a HTML tag called as script which we can actually place inside our head section. So we can type it as script. And in between these two tags, that is opening and the closing tag, I can type in any JavaScript command that I want. But it's not preferred to actually keep the JavaScript inside your head section. So generally what we do is that instead of typing it as script inside your head section, we generally go to the body section and at the end of the content, we type out the script tag. So remember, we don't actually include JavaScript inside our head section. Instead, we actually include the script tag inside our body section at the end of the content. And that is because we don't want our JavaScript to load before anything else. So we want it to load only after everything else has loaded, like HTML, CSS and everything else. So once that is done, only then JavaScript has to load. That's why we place it at the bottom of the body. Now inside this, I can type in any JavaScript command that I want. So for any programming language, the first thing that we learn is how we can actually print the data onto the screen. So in JavaScript, we can actually print the data onto the screen by typing in console.log. And inside this console.log, we can type in anything that I want. So inside this parentheses, I can type in, let's say, hi, and close it off with a semicolon. So let's say that. Now let's see how we can actually see the output. So I'm going to open this particular file using the live server. So right click here and click on open with live server. Alright, so as you can see here, the file is open in the live server, but we're not able to actually see the output. So if you want to see the output, what you have to do is that you have to right click here and click on inspect, and you have to go to the developer tools. Now inside the developer tools, you have the inspector tool, right, wherein you can actually see the HTML code. Apart from that, we also have one section called as console. So click on console, and inside this, you'll be able to see the output, that is hi. Right, so what we're trying to do here is that we're trying to output the data to the console, right? So it's going to be console.log, and in this case you can think of this console similar to this one, right? So we are trying to log a particular statement inside the console, and that is being outputted here. So remember, anytime we want to output something inside of JavaScript, we use this particular statement, and that particular output will be shown inside the console section under the developer tools. So that is one way of doing this, but this is not the preferred way, because if you do it like this, that means that you're actually typing in the JavaScript code inside the HTML page, and that's not the preferred way. Instead, what we do is that we type in this particular code inside of another JavaScript file, and we link that particular JavaScript file to this HTML page. So let's now see how we can do that. So first, let me create a file, and I'm going to name it as main.js. So the extension is going to be JS, which stands for JavaScript. Now inside this, I can remove this particular line, and I can paste it here, and I'll save that. Now, in order to actually link this particular main.js file to index.html, what we can do is that we can give in a property or an attribute for this particular script. So there's an attribute here called as src, and you can equate that to the location of the file. And in this case, the location of the file is going to be main.js. Right? So this is similar to the href attribute that we have for a link tag, or an src attribute that we have for an image tag, right? So in this src, you have to give the location of the file. It can either be online or offline, and in this case it is offline. So let's save that, and if I go to the browser once again, you'll see that the hi statement is still there. That means it is still working. So now let me place this on the left hand side and this on the right hand side. Alright, let's also close this off. And we don't need the index.html page anymore, so let's close this off. Alright, so let me increase this. Yeah, I think that should be enough. So we'll not be working on HTML anyway, so I don't need the HTML part, so that's why I've made the console full screen. So now let's see some of the basic things that we generally do inside of JavaScript. Alright, so let's now see how we can create comments. So in order to create a comment, you can go before any line that you want and you can type in 2 slashes, and that's going to comment out the whole line. If you want to create a multi-line comment, you can create it by typing in a slash, then a star, and another star, and closing it off with a slash. So anything that is present in between these will be considered to be a multi-line comment. Let me show that to you. So that is a multi-line comment. So this was a single line and this was a multi-line. Alright, so before going further, I'm assuming that you already have a basic knowledge on variables, conditional statements, loops, and functions. So if you have no idea what these programming terms mean, then it's better you check out a basic video on these programming terms. And once you're done with that, then you can carry on from here. Alright, so let's now see how we can actually create variables inside of JavaScript. So there's actually 3 keywords that we generally use when it comes to creating variables, and those are var, let, and const. So these are 3 keywords that we generally use, and the syntax for creating a variable is var space a variable name. Alright, that is how you create a variable. If you want, you can create it by using it as let as well, and that's going to work just fine. But the thing is that var is not preferred when it comes to creating variables. So instead we use let and const. So these let and const were actually introduced in JavaScript in 2015 in the ES6 version. Before that we actually had to use var, but from ES6, that is from 2015, we can now use let and const, and these are now the most preferred way of creating variables. Okay. So the reason why is because var has a global scope, whereas let and const have block level scope. Now let's move forward and let's understand the difference between let and const. So if we create a variable by giving the keyword as const, then that becomes a constant, meaning that it cannot be changed anywhere inside the program, right? So if I give it, like I say, y is equal to 20, and if I save that, and let's give the value of x as 10. Now let's output it. So it's going to be console.log. Inside that, let's output the value of x. Similarly, let's output the value of y. If I save that, you'll have 10 and 20. Now if I try to change the value of x, let's say is equal to 30, and if I save that, x is going to be 30. But if I change the value of, let's say, y is equal to 40, and if I save that, that's not going to work. Instead, it's going to show an error saying that invalid assignment to constant y. That means that you cannot actually change the value of y once it has been created, right? So we created a value of y and gave it a value of 20, right? Now I cannot change it back to 40, right? That's not going to work. We can do that if we use it as let, but if you give it as const, then that means the value is going to be constant and you cannot change it anywhere inside your program. The rest of that is the main difference. And also one more thing is that when you create a variable as well, if you give it as a let, like you don't need to initialize it to a particular value, you can just create a variable and that's going to work. But if you do the exact same thing for y, then that's not going to work, because if I save that, as you can see, uncaught syntax error in const declaration, meaning that when you create a variable with the keyword const, you cannot give it like this. You have to assign it a particular value, alright? Only then it's going to work. Now let's see some of the basic data types that we have inside of JavaScript, alright? So let me comment this out. So let's see, I'll give the value of x as, let's say, hi. Now x has a value of string. So as you can see, the output is hi. Similarly, let me showcase to you the other remaining data types as well. So we can give it as a string, which is hi, and we can also give it as 10 or 12.5. And in this case, 10 and 12.5 both represent a single data type called as number. So we don't have it differentiated like integer and floating point number. Instead, all of the numbers are considered to be a single data type called as number, right? Apart from that, you also have the null and undefined, which can be used to define null values or undefined values. Apart from that, you also have the boolean, which can either be true or false. So these are the basic data types that we generally see inside of JavaScript. So if you want, you can find out the type of a particular variable as well. Like if I comment this out and if I type it as here, type of, and if I save that, that will give me the value as string, which is saying that x has a value of string. Similarly, let's comment this out. Let's uncomment this. You'll see that it is number. If I do the exact same thing with 12.5, even then you're going to get number. So that means 10 and 12.5 both come into the category of number. And this is going to be a boolean and these are null values. Alright, so till now we've seen how we can actually output the data onto the screen. Now let's actually see how we can add some data apart from the data that you're trying to print. Alright, so like let's say I want to print a particular string here instead of this. Like let's say I want to print output is, and then I want to print a variable. The way that we can do that is by concatenating it. So that means you can first type the string that you want to print, then give a plus symbol, then give out the variable that you want to print. Like let's say in this case, it's going to be X. If I save that, you'll see that the output is 12.5. So that is one way of actually, printing out the data along with the string. But the main problem here is that if you have a lot of variables, then this gets complicated. Like let's say I have something else. If I say that, you'll have the output, but as you can see, as the number of variables increases, the statement also increases in size, and it gets complicated when you have a lot of variables. So in order to simplify this, what the developers have done is that they have created a different type of, representation called as template literals. So it's template literals. So the syntax is pretty similar. You'll type in the console log first. Now inside this, instead of typing a single quotation or a double quotation, what we do is that we type out the backticks. So we have a backtick on your keyboard, and that is actually present above the tab symbol and just before the one number. That is the left of the number one. So there is a backtick, right? So click on that, and that's going to type in the backticks. Inside this, you can type in the string. Like let's say I'm going to type it as output is, then give a space. Then you have to follow a particular syntax. So it's going to be a dollar symbol, then followed by curly braces. Inside this, you can type out the variable that you want to actually use. So in this case, it is X. So the output is X. As you can see, we have the output. So in this way, you can actually use this particular syntax and type in any number of variables inside your particular string that you want. So this was also introduced in ES6, that is in 2015. Before that, we actually had to follow this, but from ES6, we have this particular thing that you can actually use. Alright, so now let's move on to conditional statements, right? So let me comment this out completely, and let's go below this, right? So let me create two variables. So it's going to be const a is equal to 10, const b is equal to 20. Alright, so there are two things that I forgot to mention, and the first one is that this semicolon is not mandatory. So even if I just remove the semicolon, it's going to work just fine without any errors, right? So the semicolon is like an optional thing, but it is best practice to always do so. That's why I'm trying to add semicolons at the end. But even if you don't do it, it's going to work just fine. The second thing is that when we create a variable, we generally define it using the const keyword. The only time that we actually use the let is when that particular variable might have a different value in the program. So if that value will not change, then we generally use const. So that is also considered to be a best practice, right? So try to create a variables in const. Alright, so now let's say I want to check if the value of A is greater than the value of B or not. So for that, we're going to use the conditional statements. So it's going to be something like this. The syntax is so it's going to be if A is greater than B, then console log the output saying that A is greater than B. So this particular syntax is similar to the if conditions that we generally see inside of Java or C or any other programming language, right? So we're going to give the condition here inside the if statement, and if it is true, then this particular statement will execute. So as you can see here, if I save this, there's no output inside the console. That is because A is not greater than B, right? So let's give it as, let's say 30. Now if I save that, you'll see that A is greater than B, right? So let's change it back to 1. As you can see here, we don't have any output, right? Since A is not greater than B. Since this condition is failing, this is not being executed. So we want to have an else statement that will execute if this condition fails. So it's going to be, let's type it as no. And as you can see here, the output is going to be no. That is because this condition is failing, and that is because A is not greater than B. But let's say I want to use an intermediary condition checking for whether A is equivalent to B. In that case, I can type in another condition here saying that else if. So we are combining else and if at the same time. And if I do that, I can type in console.log. Inside this, I can type in the statement that I want. Now let's give out the condition. So here I want to check if A is equivalent to B. So it's going to be double equal to. And inside this, I can type out the statement. So one thing that you have to observe here is that when you want to equate something, then you're going to use double equal to, and when you want to assign a value to a variable, then you're going to use single equal to. Alright. So now if I save this, as you can see, A is equal to B is not being printed. This is also not being printed. Instead, this is being printed because these two conditions have failed. Now let's say if I give it as 10, then it's going to show that A is equivalent to B. Alright, so this is good. But let's say I only have one statement saying that if A is greater than B, print this, or else print this, right? So for just that single condition, we have to write this whole structure, and that is not that productive. So what we do is that if you have a simple condition, we use something else, right? It's called a ternary operator. So that is a different kind of representation for this. So it's going to be So it's going to be the ternary representation of this particular if-else statement. So let me showcase that to you. So the syntax for that is something like this. So it's going to be condition, then you're going to have a question mark. If this condition is true, then a particular statement will execute. Else, if that condition fails, statement 2 will execute, right? So if this condition is true, this will execute, else this will execute. So let me showcase that to you for this particular example. So it's going to be condition, right? So let's give it as, let's say A is greater than B. If that is true, then statement 1, which is true, like let's say A is greater than B, right? Or I can type in as A is. If that condition fails, I wanted to say no. So we actually need to output this, right? So let me wrap this inside of a console log so that it will actually output that data. Now if I say that, as you can see, no is being defined, and that is because in this case A is not greater than B. So if I give it as, let's say 20, you'll see that A is greater than B because this is being printed, right? So in this way, you can actually write a shorthand notation of this particular if-else statement, and that is a ternary representation. Alright, so now let's move on to seeing how we can actually create arrays inside of a JavaScript file. So there's actually two ways of creating arrays. The first way is by using a constructor. So before doing that, let me first create a variable, and let's give it as, let's say, test array, and let's equate that to a new array. So we are using the array constructor. Inside this, I can type in any numbers that I want. Like let's say I can give it as 1, 2, 3. That is going to create an array. Now if I console log this, if I say that, as you can see, the array is being printed and it has 3 values inside of it, 1, 2 and 3. So this is one way of creating an array, but this is not the preferred way. We generally create arrays by typing in a variable name first. Then we equate that to square brackets. Now inside the square brackets, you can define any value that I want. So let's say I'll give it as A. So the thing is that inside of JavaScript arrays, we don't actually need to use just a particular data type. Like let's say I can add in numbers as well, or I can add in true or false, there's boolean, or I can define null values as well. So like an array inside of a JavaScript can contain any kind of data. It doesn't mean like you can only have one particular data type. It can have a lot of data types. Like, so if I save this, as you can see, you'll have the test array which has 7 values, and these are the 7 values. So the thing is that if you maximize this, you'll see that apart from these values, you have an operator called as length, right? So this property that you're seeing for this array is accessible for us. So if I type in, like, let's say length here, if I save that, you'll see the output being shown as 7, right? So since that is a property, there is no brackets here. You can just type it as length, and that's going to show the output. So in this way, you can find out the length of a particular array as well. Now let's see how we can actually access individual elements inside of this. So to access individual elements inside of this, you can type in the square brackets. Inside the square brackets, you can give the ID of this thing, right? So if I save this, you'll see that you have these elements, and if I maximize this, you'll see that each and every element has a particular number associated with it. That number is called as the ID of this particular element, right? So if I want to, let's say, access this B, the ID is going to be 1. So I can just type in a square bracket. Inside the square bracket, I can type in the 1. If I save that, you'll see that the output is showing as B. Similarly, if I give it as, let's say, 2, it's going to be C. So it starts from 0, like from here, and goes on till the end of the list. Now let's say you want to actually change a particular value inside of this. Like let's say I want to change this from C to E. So the way that I can do that is by typing in test array first, and inside that, let's access the element that is going to be the second element, that is C, and let's equate that to, let's say, E. Let me save that. Now you'll see the value has changed to E. Let's output the whole array. You'll see that we have A, B, and then E. Apart from that, let's say you want to add an element at the end of this array. The way that you can do that is by typing in test array dot push. Now that is a method that we have for this array. Alright. So for arrays, we have a method called as push, and inside the curly braces, you can type in the element that you want to add. Let's say I want to add it as 10. Let's save that, and when you print the test array, you'll see that we'll have 10 at the end of this list. Similarly, you can remove an element from that as well. The syntax is similar. You can just type it as pop. Now if I say that, you'll see that 10 has been removed from the end of the list. So in this way, you can create arrays, you can add elements to it, you can push or pop from it, and you can also actually access the length. Alright, so now let's move on to loops. So there are a lot of loops that we have inside of JavaScript, but I'll be explaining only two of the loops that we'll be using. That is the for loop and the while loop. Apart from that, we also have for each loop and other kinds of mapping mechanisms as well. So we'll have Angular videos as well, right? So in those videos, if we require the loops, which is like for each loop or something like that, at that point I'll explain how we can actually use that, right? For now, let's only worry about the for loop and the while loop. So the syntax for creating a for loop is something like this. So the control flow inside of a for loop is something like this. The first thing that we're going to see is the initializer. So it's going to initialize I to 0 first. Then it's going to check if I is less than 10 or not, and that is true. So it's going to go inside the loop and execute this particular statement. Then it's going to come out of the loop and increment the value of I once again. Then it's going to check the condition for the second time and execute once again. So that's going to go on till the value of I is less than 10. Once it is equal to or greater than 10, it's going to exit out of the loop, right? So that's why we have the numbers from starting 0 till the number 9 that is less than 10. So using the exact same syntax, if I want, I can actually access the elements inside of the array as well. So we have the test array here, right? So let me uncomment this. So we have a test array. Now let's say I want to access the elements inside of this test array. So instead of typing it as I can type it as test array. And inside the square brackets, I can type in the I value. And if I save that, you'll see that we'll have all the values. But the main problem here is that we don't have 10 values inside of the array, right? We only have around 7 values, right? So now instead of giving it as 10, I can give it as the length of the array. So I can type it as, if I say that, it's going to execute only till the end of the array. So in that way, you can loop through any array and you can also get any element present inside of an array. All right. If you want, you can write in an if condition instead of this as well, and you can make it more complex as you want. Now let's look at the while loop. So let me recreate the same exact thing, but while using the while loop, right? So the condition is going to be something like this. While a condition is true, a particular thing will be executed inside the curly braces. So for that, let me create another variable. Let z is equal to 0. So it's going to be 0 at the start, and until z is less than 10, it's going to execute a particular statement saying that console log z. Alright, so now if I save this, as you can see here, the output is actually going on with only zeros, and it is actually inside of an infinite loop. So that is because we actually haven't changed the value of z once this has been printed. So if you want to not have an infinite loop, what you have to do is that you have to actually increment z. So there's actually 3 ways of doing so. Let's see the first way. It's going to be z plus plus, and if I save that, so let's close this off once again. So I'm going to open this, I'll close this off here, I'll open that live server once again. Let's go to the console log. As you can see here, you have the values from 0 till 9. So it is first initialized to 0, then it's checking the condition, then it's printing it out, then incrementing and checking the condition once again. And unless and until the value of z is greater than 10, it's going to execute this particular statements. So the second way of incrementing a value is by typing in z is equal to z plus 1. That's going to increase the value of z by 1. Or you can give it a shorthand notation as well. Z plus is equal to 1. That is also equivalent to z plus 1. So 3 of these statements actually increment the value of z by 1. But the main problem here is that you can only use this when you want to increment by 1. If you want to increment by 2, z plus 1 will not work. Instead, you can actually use this. Like you can type it here 2 or 2 here, and that's going to actually increment the value of z by 2. So let me minimize this. Yeah, you have 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, right? So you're going to get only the even values. So in this way, you can actually increment this or implement this, right? Alright, so the next thing that we're going to see are functions. So let me showcase how we can create functions inside of JavaScript as well. So we've created a function called as test, and inside that function I have a statement called as console.log hi. Now if I save that, you'll see that you'll not have any output inside the console log, and that is because we actually haven't executed this particular function. So if you want to execute a function, you have to actually call it, right? So I can type out the function name here, and once I save that, you'll see that the function is being executed, right? So this particular statement has been executed. So in this way, you can create a function and you can execute that particular function. Now let's say I want to pass some values to this particular function. What I can do is that I can type out, let's say a value here called as Kamal, and I can place a variable here, let's say called as name. Then I can type out the statement this, and also let's use the ES6 syntax, that is a backward ticks, right? So we have the ticks, right? So I'll type that out, and I'll use this dollar and curly braces and type out the name variable. If I save that, as you can see, we'll have that hi, this is Kamal. So in this way, you can pass the parameters. But what happens if I forget this? Like, let's say if I remove this from here, and if I say this, you'll see that we have the output, but it is undefined because the variable name is undefined right now. So if you forget that to actually give, this is what is going to be outputted. So in some cases, we don't want that to happen. So in that case, what you can do is that you can give it a default value, like let's say test. So now what happens is that if I forget to give out the value here, then automatically the name will be assigned a value called as test, and that will be outputted here, right? So you have hi, this is test. But if I give a value here, like let's say Kamal, and if I save that, you'll see that hi, this is Kamal is being printed, even though name is being equated to test here, right? So this is a default value which will only work if we forget to give out the value here. So in that way, you can create a function, you can pass the values from here, you can execute that function. If you want, instead of typing the data directly here, you can return the statement and assign it to a value here in this case, then print that out, right? So you can go complex and make it however you want. Alright, so those are the basic programming concepts that we need to learn when it comes to JavaScript. So apart from this, we also have a lot of things that we'll cover in the next video. So we'll be learning about object literals, DOM manipulation, events, and form submissions. All of that will be covered in the next video. Alright, so before closing this off, I just wanted to say that this video was made in collaboration with packetcode. So packetcode is a training and placement company located in Hyderabad, and these videos were specifically made for the job guarantee training program that they have going on right now, and that is the full stack Java developer program. So apart from these free video lectures, they also have some premium content as well, like lecture notes, practice and test papers for you to get better at your core concepts. And they also have offline as well as online classes for this program. And they also conduct multiple demo sessions as well. So you can attend any of these demo sessions and understand the things they are teaching as well as their training approach firsthand. So if you're interested, I've provided the website link in the description down below. You can go there and check them out. So that's it for this video, guys. I hope you have liked what you've seen till now. If you did, then please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe as well. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.